Hi everyone. In this demo, we're going to be covering a lot of things. We're going to first start off with a grasshopper on a cattail. That one we will trace out just for those who want to dive right into painting and then may have a little bit of issues with pencil drawing or freehand sketching. Then the next one, we're going to actually take that same drawing and we're going to morph it into a grasshopper robot. And that will just give you a rough idea where I come up with my concepts. For the sci-fi, I actually used to do that quite a bit when I was back in my Art Institute of Pittsburgh days. Frank Frazetta was a hero of mine, believe it or not. What we will do then is just to give you a rough idea and show you how I actually would come up with some of the ideas of making a sci-fi painting, not meant to be an award winner, but just give you an idea of where I would come up with some of the concepts we could use in a drawing such as that. Then we will move in to an actual portrait of an elephant that I just photographed at the Pittsburgh Zoo. Again, just basic references you could get from just about anywhere, or more importantly, use them as you can. Now, a lot of the photographs I photograph, I have a painting in mind, so a lot of them I will photograph ready to paint. So in some cases, I don't change very much from my original landscape or my original painting that I'm working with, but then when I go to add, whether it be subjects, whether it be flying birds, or something that I have to shoot with a different camera and lens setup, then I will add that in later. Something a camera cannot do, whether it be trying to catch a bird in flight at a specific distance and then put that into a wide angle shot that's in focus from foreground all the way to the deepest background. With all that in mind, let's get started and we'll start going over our first grasshopper painting. Okay, to get us started, we are going to open up a piece of paper, 12 by 18. It will be a vertical for this first one. Go ahead and open it up. Now that we have our paper in place, I want to make sure I want the handmade paper cold press instead of the white simple, and we're going to keep it white, pure white. Okay, now that's done. There's our watercolor texture. Fit that back on the screen, and now we're going to import our picture. Now this one we're going to trace, just for those who need help with just getting started and just want to dive right into painting. But the second painting we will be doing in this demo, we will freehand draw it, and that will be the elephant portrait. We'll go up here to File, Import Image, and here's my two references right here. I will go ahead and hit this grasshopper shot right here. And this is actually a scan from a 4x6 print from way back in my print days. I'm going to put about right there. I'll make this a little wee bit higher. And it doesn't matter if the photograph falls short on either end, because we're just going to splash in the background anyway. And we may make even in a vignette sense and not even carry all the paint to the very edges. That's okay there. We're going to hit that OK. Now that our photograph is in place, I'm going to flip-flop these two layers. And then what I will do is change this one to 50. Let's try 40. Yeah, that's dark enough. And then we're going to make this one the drawing. And that's it. And now what I'll do is I'll trace this out. And then once we have the drawing and the tracing ready to go, we could give ourselves as many chances or tries at different outcomes as we want. Let's go ahead and get this traced. Let's take a look and see how our colors are going to mix in what quite literally will be a traditional way. And what I mean by that is colors, the way I handle my colors and the water and the wet layers and everything are just about identical to how I would paint it in a traditional form. Now here's the big thing. If I want to, I'm just going to zoom in just a little wee bit, go to my watercolors, and then I will use this bloom brush right here. I'm going to keep the opacity. I'll turn it up just a little bit so we could see some action, because this is not going to be a part of the painting. This will just be a practice layer to show you how things are going to work once we start painting. Now I'm going to start with yellow right there, and then we're going to just splash this around. And with this bloom wet, it will create a pretty strong texture to start with. And being that this color is just about throughout our entire photograph, I could just take it everywhere and leave it bleed together with the other colors I'm going to add, only because everything in a lot of the areas of the grasshopper, the cattail, have to go quite a bit darker. So what I'm just going to be doing is adding darker shapes on top of what's already there. Now let's take a little wee bit of that gold. Now let's do a little bit of orange first. And just to get some mixing here. And then remember, as long as I'm brushing, the diffuse is on pause, for lack of better words. That it's not really mixing too much right now, as long as I keep painting. And then I'll go to the gold. And what I want to put the gold around is actually the cattail itself, and make this bottom a little wee bit darker than everything else. And we could add colors to it again. And what I want to stress is, if you want to keep certain sections of what you really like once the colors start blending together, it might be better to go to another layer, and so you keep what you have already intact. Okay, now we got some paint down, and we're just going to let that work. And you can see it's already starting to bubble up. And what it'll do is it'll start to bloom, and we'll just let it do its thing. Through the wonders of editing, I did speed this up quite a bit. So just to let you know, the total time of mixing was about 3 minutes. I didn't want to speed it up too much, only to give you a chance to watch the actual colors mix to see what they will do. Okay, let's take a look and see what we got. It's been working ever since. It's still working yet. I haven't quick dried it yet, but we're getting some really nice blooms and some color mixing here, and some interesting edges that if I zoom into that, that's all the watercolor itself. I should say the water doing its job, and it's mixing these colors, especially right in here, and then right in here. Let's go to our arrow. Right in here, there's some very interesting subtle patterns, because that's all I want now, because I got to go quite a bit darker in a lot of the areas. So we got to think of how much darker we have to go yet. So now if I fit this back on a screen, now you could see a very specific pattern of what's going on as far as just all the blooming. Now, if I quick dry it, okay, now I quick dried it, now it'll stop blending, but the layer will obviously stay wet, and that's the big advantage of quick dry, because it'll just stop the blending action, but it will keep the layer wet. So if you want to keep on adding paint to the layer, whether it be new colors, additional color of the same colors, whatever, it'll be ready to go. But now here's the thing. If I put any more color on it now, it will surely disturb what I already have down. It's going to start lifting up what I have. So if I have some really nice hard edges in here, then it's going to soften them up if I put more color down on it. Now I could show you that. If I just say, for example, I'll zoom in, and then I'll take a more yellow to try and keep it lighter. But because I'm putting down a water on top, then what it's going to do is it's going to completely soften these edges up, and it's going to start bleeding out into new blooms. So if you want to keep on experimenting with what kind of bloom you end up with, you could see the bloom right here of where I just put down a color, and it's going to keep on bleeding that out. Now here is going to be an interesting thing. Now if I get that real hard shape, now here's what you have to think of. I'm putting out very subtle color at a time, but because it's making that strong bloom and strong edges, those might overpower your grasshopper or whatever you're painting itself. Once you start introducing very strong shapes to the background, foreground, wherever, then the patterns of the watercolor might overpower your subject. You can see how strong they are now. Now we have a long ways to go before it's completed, and make it everything darker and darker. But then we could actually decide that if these blooms were on separate layers, then we can even turn down the opacity on that layer just to lighten them up if they're overpowering. That's one big advantage you'll have of keeping everything on a separate layer. But now here's the other thing. I will quick dry that right where it's at. And that will stop these new blooms from continuing. But what I want to show you is now I'll show you everything is still wet. But if I even dry the entire layer right here at the top of the layers panel, now everything is dry. But now if I take my water tool, and I'll use this splash course, we'll even put a direction to this, just a little wee bit of action, just to give everything a flow. If I put down water on top of those new blooms, and we'll let it do its thing again, and this is even if the layer has been dried. And I'll turn this off and we can watch and see what happens. As you could see, the water that we introduced to that same layer, even though it was dry, is starting to carry our new blooms in the angle of our tilt. So number one, be patient when colors are mixing. Number two, always protect a layer if you see something you like by introducing a new layer. Okay, I will go ahead and stop it here. I'll fast dry it there. And what I wanted to show you is, I'll go back to my pointer, just how much, even though I dried the layer. Now, if I didn't dry the layer, this would change a lot faster, just like the last time when it made those big giant blooms pretty quick. Even though I dried the layer on dry paper and then just put clear water down, it still lifted up some of our blooms and some of our color and made a directional splash because we have it on a direction and carried some of these in a very specific pattern. I mean, that is about as natural as you could get when it comes to the colors blending and bleeding together, and they're kind of washing in a water dampened or even water soaked paper way. Now, with that in mind, what I would suggest then is, even if you dry the layer, as you're working, especially if you take time to work, things may be changing in your painting and you may not realize it. That has happened to me, that if I don't keep getting into a habit of fast drying, then it will keep on changing the color patterns and also mixing. But then also, if I don't create a new layer and keep painting real slow on another layer, then some of that same layer might be changing without me knowing it, because it's going to keep on mixing. So what is my point? My point would be is, if you want to keep any specific patterns that you really like, save it as that separate layer and then start from a new layer from there on. Then that way you'll always have that one layer exactly the way you want it, and you won't accidentally change it. Now, with that in mind, let's go ahead and dive in to see how we're going to actually paint this grasshopper. Okay, now that we know that layering might be a safe way to go if we want to retain patterns and not destroy them or diffuse them by further painting, let's take another look at even some more advantages of layering. And that is this area right in here. First, we'll open up. We'll go to Window and then go to Reference Images. That's right here. And if I click on that, it'll open up this little pop-up. And if I click on this, I will go to this button right here, open up my reference, and this is it right here. And once I click on it and then open it up, we'll make it bigger so we can see what we're doing. And if you notice right in here, this is an area of the very top of the cattail broken off. Then the leg is a little wee bit darker. Again, we could do this and really tell what is going on with our photograph. So being that the leg is a little wee bit darker, then that means we can actually paint the cattail, but then know that we have to paint the leg darker. That should cover up the patterns of the actual cattail itself. But now, if you have some hardcore patterns, then you may have two choices. And what I mean by that is, if we just to give you a rough idea, if I take this and then even create a new layer, and then this would just be the cattail, and if I start going back to even some of my raw umbers and maybe even a tinge of orange, I will just start with those colors there, and I will go back to even just my bloom again, and just to actually start with it, and I'll just take it down a little bit of a color at a time. And again, for your personal choice, you could actually just select this out with a freehand tool and go to town, or leave it splash over. That's depending on how your end result is going to look and how you actually want it to look. But now if I go back in and then just paint some of this raw umber on a new layer, and I did not wet it first, and then I'm going to just leave it drip. But this is just, again, this is not going to be a part of the final painting. This is just going to be, we're going to quick dry that. That's a very strong pattern, because we got this guy on. We're going to turn him off, and there is a strong pattern. But now if the background pattern starts to bleed through, and this is what I wanted to get at, we'll end up destroying that pattern. I'll put a little wee bit of orange in there. And now the yellows are coming through, so that's okay. Because there's a lot of yellows in the entire photograph anyway. Now I'll start to destroy some of that real hard pattern that I originally started with, because the tilt was on. So that's okay too. But now if we start getting patterns that we don't want, a little bit of texture here and there will be nice, and then we could stop it and then add some more to it. But now if this pattern from your background is too strong and it's coming through, what it's going to do is it's going to eliminate the fact that the background is the background. And what I mean by that is, if I just go back to my background and grab my eraser, I'm going to take it down just a little bit, and we want 100% opacity. If I erase the background, and again, this is just an option, if I erase the background, then that's going to change the entire look of the cattail. But what it'll do is it'll keep the pattern of the cattail in front of the actual pattern of the background. So they're not confusing in the sense that you're going to tend to flatten everything out. It's okay in basic traditional watercolors if you have very subtle patterns like this. Let me grab my arrow. If you have very subtle patterns like this coming through the actual grasshopper, then that's okay. But here's the point. It just depends on whether or not your patterns are going to start getting confusing to a typical viewer, where then now all of a sudden I can easily put yellows and golds back into this cattail and have the color unity. But what it'll do though is it will be less confusing if that pattern of the background bleeds through my cattail, if that makes sense. So in other words, all I'm trying to do is control my patterns and make sure they don't overpower the subject or flatten my painting. Now, let's take a look at some of these things over here of what actually happened. And then you could see that there are some very subtle patterns. And that was from this brush right here, my coarse water, because when I put it down, and I'll show wet, this is the actual, actually I'll dry that off just to give you a better idea. Now what happens here with all these little bleeds of color, if I put this down, all those areas in between the blue is the dry areas, and that's where the color is going to mix but then stop, because it's a hard edge, dried edge. So that's where I'm getting these real nice shapes of all kind of different things happening. And that's only because I just used my water brush and left things bleed. Now they'll bleed again if I leave this long enough. Because keep in mind, the last couple times I left things bleed, it was an average of about 3 minutes that I just left it sit. So be patient. Now, with this all said, we're going to start from scratch and we're going to start doing our Grasshopper from the beginning with the save the Rebelle file. But then remember, these are just options. You could have easily left that pattern over the cattail if you wanted, but it depends on how strong the pattern is. If it starts getting too confusing and that it's overpowering the cattail and it's making the background look like it's in front of the cattail, then that's when it may get confusing. Otherwise, it'll have to be your decision and your choice at the time of the painting. Let's get this started and we will dive in and start painting this Grasshopper for the final time. Okay, I'm starting from scratch with all my background colors and I'm leaving them blend, and I may do a couple of layers just to add complexity to the background. Now, the way the colors originally go down may be quite different from what the water will do to them once they start mixing. And again, it's very important to note that on average, I am waiting anywhere from 3 to 4 minutes just to see what happens, but I do watch it the whole time so it doesn't stray away from what I am actually looking for. I will stop it, or with one single undo, I could undo the entire drift of the water and colors together. Now I'm just going over some of the actual details of the legs and the upper body of the Grasshopper itself. And then what I'll do is just slowly layer some of the different colors to start with. And I do like using layers because, as we've seen, if you actually do even dry the layer, using the water tool will still lift up those colors even on a dry layer. So if you start working in different areas of the painting and you're not paying attention, you may end up with some odd shapes that you really weren't planning on that may start. Let's take a look and see how we did those drips. Okay, let's take a break and just see how we created these drips, and just to go over it a little bit more in detail. First, I'm actually going to open up a new sheet of paper, and we will stay with the 12 by 18 vertical, same everything. Okay, now we got our new paper. I'm going to stay with the same flat glaze brush. We'll use our cadmium lemon. And now keep in mind, the settings for this were just create drips 7 and 5. And of course, you would want to go over your DPI and your size of your painting in proportion with what you think an actual drip would be in proportion to your painting. When water starts to drip, a good idea would be to keep it looking realistic. And then now we have the tilt also maxed straight down. And if I actually, I'll just turn off the opacity just a little bit, and we'll just make a couple of swatches there, and as soon as it starts to drip, okay, now here's some drips starting to happen now. This is what we were waiting for. I just put one layer of yellow down, so it's just going to react, and this is the size and shape I have my drips. Now here's the first important thing. If we use our transparent lock, it's going to stop those drips right where they're at, but it will keep on mixing. Because remember, I don't have anything wet other than where I put the yellow down. You cannot wet the layer first or the transparency lock won't work. So if I hit the transparency lock now, the drips will stop where they're at, and then what I can actually do is introduce another color any way I want. Just say, for example, if I grab even a different brush, my bloom brush, and go to a cobalt violet, or how about the gold, what I used there. We'll make it bigger. I'll put a little bit of water in it. Now, since I have the transparency lock on, then if I go back over it, I'm only going to put gold, the quinacridone gold, where the yellow is. So that way I can actually put down some more color, but it will be in a very specific area. But my drips are stopped now. If I release the transparency lock, then what will happen is they'll start dripping again, but now they'll have the gold mixed in with it. And then keep in mind, now this is still only the show wet area. Now, what we could do to make this even a little bit more intricate is if I leave the show wet on, go to my water tool, and then I will take the splash course, leave it as big as I can. If I start putting splashes down around these drips, then what's going to happen is it's actually going to diffuse out those runs, and the color itself is going to start going in to those actual small patches of water there in between the dry paper. You can see right in here where the color is starting to diffuse out into the water that I put down from the coarse splash with just the water tool. So if I turn that off, then now you can see what kind of patterns we're getting here, and they're actually looking pretty interesting. But here's the point. By then also keeping this on its own layer, I could let this mix for a while and let them run more if I wanted to. If I put the actual transparency lock on again, then keep in mind, I'm going to go back and start putting color in any wet area now. So it will change since I use the water tool. But if I leave it just run the way it is, once I have it to where I want, I could just set it in place by the fast dry. But because I have it on my own separate layer, then I could actually easily fast dry it now, just for example, and then obviously go to the move tool and then move it anywhere I want. And that way, if I get a nice set of runs and shapes and colors and blending that I like, but may not really relate too well to my composition or my subject itself, then I could reposition it if I need to. And just like I did on the Grasshopper, the runs there, I could hit OK, but then what I could do is go to my erase tool and actually go back and even take some of this out if I want to. And then if I don't even like this run down here and I want to take all of this out, then what will happen is I could actually create the shape of runs I want, and because it's several layers of colors overlapping each other, you'd be hard-pressed to find out where my run layer ends and any other layers begin. So just a couple of things to keep in mind that you could just create a little bit of a more interesting or dramatic set of drips and runs. And then also the most important is if you use your transparency lock while your runs are going, you could stop them from running, but you'll still keep on mixing colors and they'll still keep working. They just won't run anymore because it will stop your runs on the actual footprint of the water, so to speak, that's at that current time. Let's go ahead and finish this painting. Okay, now I'm just working in more of the details of the face. And then again, if I start working with more intricate details, I don't want my thin, fine lines to bleed out into all the other colors that are there. So what I will do is constantly put those details on their own layers so they're not affected by any other colors that are already down. In some places where I actually used the freehand selection tool, I went overly large on the outside edges so I could make the cattail kind of fuzzy on the edges where I did not want a straight line. Working with some of the details of the Grasshopper itself, in an artistic kind of way, I can actually put in some colors that may look well as far as color unity or complementary colors, so to speak. But in the illustration days, I had several contracts with magazines that prided themselves on anatomical accuracy. So for that reason, you could use some colors to shade areas, to highlight areas. But if you start introducing colors that really did not belong on the animal that you are trying to portray, then that could be a problem as to how you are representing that particular animal. Now that I'm going ahead with some of the actual shadows and details of the Grasshopper itself, these runs I'm making now, it's very important to know that those typical runs have a very strong parallel line pattern. And to keep them subdued, it's nice to also keep them on their own layer so you can control the opacity if you need to. After all, is this a painting of a grasshopper or drips? Okay, let's take a look and see what we have here. Just a couple of things to note. This one is just kind of like 3/4 detailed and then just a little bit loose on the bottom. The abdomen runs off into the drips. Now, I turned down the drips all the way down to 50%. If I turn them up to 100, they get pretty dark. And for me, even more on the overpowering side. Now, since I want this to be an illustration of a grasshopper with just kind of like splashy after effects, then I don't want to put too much attention to the drips. Not only is the opacity pretty strong, but keep in mind that parallel lines are very eye-grabbing. They create what would be considered a flat plane that looks right back at you. So without them having any converging lines, they lack direction. Now, of course, that's only an opinion, and in composition, nothing is guaranteed. Now, if I want to take a look back at these drips themselves, I do want to point out one important thing, and that is, if I look at the drips themselves, keep in mind that another important reason to have the drips on their own layers is when I made these little wee black shapes, I already had them made and then put them on their own layer, dried. But whether they were dry or not, again, it wouldn't matter. But what would happen is if I wanted some of this black dripping down, if I go to make that drip, even if it's on its own layer, then my whole entire little splotch of black is going to start moving down. So it's not only going to move out of the original area I wanted it to, but it's also going to morph into a shape that was not originally intended. So in other words, if I want to make this shape look like it's dripping down, but then also retain its original shape, then I got to make sure I make that into two different layers. That is kind of important, because if I make a splotch of paint over here and have the drips turned on, then the entire splotch is going to start moving down. Yes, it will run into nice spontaneous drips, but the whole entire splotch is also going to start moving down if we have the tilt up pretty high. So with that in mind, you may want to keep the original shape there intact. You can even make it lighter than you meant to have it. That way it will look like some of the color is running down. But in this particular case, I just chose to do it the way I did it, just to give you an example of why layering may help also. Now, again, with all the different types of runs that we have, I would actually probably keep this on 50 just to actually have the runs there, but not necessarily have them too loud or too overpowering compared to this shape right here that I want. And then that way I will actually have what I'm looking for, and that would be just a splashy illustration of a grasshopper. Now, with all that said, let's move into the bonus round, and we're going to draw this guy out, but we're going to just use the original drawing to morph it into a robot. But this is just more or less my thought process of how I would start drawing something and my reasoning behind drawing what I am drawing. Let's move into the bonus round. Okay, welcome to the bonus round. Now, this entire robot grasshopper is just to show you how many different things I would actually use in real life, just to give me ideas on how to draw. The smaller front legs, I would actually duplicate them from the workings of a backhoe. The hydraulics of a strong backhoe arm have great power with very little leverage. The tail I'm working with, I start making it into a scorpion-like tail with plates such that would be copied from the hood of a cobra. When the cobra fans its neck out, that would be the same principle. And as I draw, I'm drawing it in a finished form because I want to see how things progress as I watch them. Now I decided to curl the tail up and draw that illusion to adjust the plates and everything that goes with it, to make it look like what may end up being a female about to lay eggs. Drawing the wings, I wanted them to fold in And I was thinking of an F-14, how wings fold in, and also those are copied from a peregrine falcon. From a power dive, they actually fold their wings in for greater speed and less air resistance. Creating the eyes, if you want to create a mean-looking eye, you could duplicate a bald eagle or golden eagle. Those two birds are next to impossible to paint without them looking mean or aggressive. Now, making a little egg sacs, I'm further progressing this drawing in the sense that I want to try to figure out how would I encapsulate the eggs. This typical gutter shape I may change, a little bit too simple. So what I did was protect it in an encased casing for the eggs, just something that may actually happen in real life. Using the figure drawing of the fig tree that I just painted, I'm actually doing that instead of the gutter shape, which is a little bit more complex and a little bit unusual, even in real life. Now putting the thorns on makes it a little wee bit unhospitable, which would be considered that type of environment. And those are actually duplicated from a tree called a devil's walking stick. Let's take a look and see what we got. Okay, let's take a look at how I would just kind of give myself a rough idea where to start at with an illustration such as this. My key goal is always to be as original as possible. That's why I really stress on trying to have my own references and photos to go by only. That's the only thing I do. But also more importantly is that when I take my own photos, I have a good idea what's going on with the photo if I need added information. And I'll get into that here real quick. But this particular painting, I would actually use a mask on this because unlike the darker Grasshopper up against a light background, if we say, for example, wanted to make this a chrome-looking robot, then I would want a lighter colored robot up against a dark background. And just to have what we could consider some type of a sci-fi look, then I would actually use colors and blend colors together that would not be considered your everyday background colors. Now again, just by everything we drew out, that would be somewhat of a start, but to add color to all of this, it would be the same thing as far as if we wanted to make this chrome. Here's an example of what I would use for my own references, and that would be this right here, which is a very good example of chrome. But the idea is that since I took these photos myself, I would have a rough idea of what's going on with the photos. Now, for example, all the colors and everything that's reflected in all of this chrome is actually the surrounding colors. The tans are the gravel parking lot it was at, and all of the black lines are actually the shadows of the deep dark areas of the engine itself. And then you could start to see a real vibrant red right here along this edge that would actually be the red of the tank. And the same thing with this shape right here, and then the fins, and depending on what's going on with any of the actual contours of the chrome. In other words, for those who did auto painting before, they would understand what an orange pill effect would be. And that is something to even consider. Again, just like this one over here, same thing here. Now, one thing I would want to retain in this particular photo is that this flame is actually embossed on the actual muffler itself. So I would want to know that it's reflecting different things. And once I could start building up how different shapes and contours reflect, they're all just like mini mirrors facing a specific direction. And if I know what colors are in that direction, then I could add it and make it look like chrome. Now, I'm obviously not going to finish this painting because I don't have the time to finish this in this particular demo because we got an elephant to get to. But just to give you a rough idea how we would do something like this, we are going to add just a little bit of color, and we'll start the eggs, and we'll go into just a little bit of color to start in the cobra hood type scorpion tail, and then that will be it, and we'll move on. Let's just do just a little bit to this, just to give a rough idea how it may look. Okay, this would be the biggest reason that I would want to actually use this painting with a mask. My lighter areas of the actual robot Grasshopper is going to need protected from the darker colors of the background. And then just keep in mind that as I'm painting this, I wanted to make the eggs an off color so I could reflect them into the underside of the tail where it curls down underneath the actual nest itself. This way I can actually introduce some colors that are being reflected that are like no other colors in the painting. Now just working with the spheres, what I'm doing now is actually protecting some of the areas, because again, I will put up some cards of the elaborate fig painting I did that could explain what I'm doing right now. Then also the selected area within a masked area, which is just more or less advanced ways of protecting some of your painting area if you need to. Some of these areas that I'm painting now, just the reflections and different things going on, I would go in and refine some of those and bring out some more details, and also just to figure out what's going on within the painting. Okay, let's take a look and see what we have. And that is, I think one thing that's very important when it comes to layering is that we cannot overlook we're doing these in a digital way. It is great to be able to work traditional watercolors, but we're using the advantages of digital. And that is something easily overlooked once you start working in a digital way. And that is so important, to be able to save different multiple layers that are all editable that you could go back to. Even if you want to start experimenting with them, you could duplicate them over and save them in a group as a backup. You could always go back to specific points of where your painting started. That is such an important thing. To a certain extent, it can become overwhelming that would give you too many choices of what you can actually do compositionally. Now, in this one here, just real quickly, I would even say that using the mask, right now I have the mask layer on the transparent to block the transparent, and that again would be just the opposite of what you see black now. But now if I change that to mask opaque, then I would be able to paint anywhere in the background area, and that would be important. That what I'm looking at now is, say for example, I take my actual brush, we can even just use this one, and I'll turn it up just a little bit. And what I could do is immediately create 3 layers. Now, I think if I would do a painting such as this, I would want more background area just to really put this guy, or gal for that matter, in its environment. So in other words, this line right here of the orange cloud coming down in red could be actually a murky swamp, a murky lagoon, you name it, you could make it, only because it could be a cloud hovering over what would be considered the unknown. And for that reason, I could immediately create 3 layers just by starting with something dead here that would go up through here, but then I could draw right over my grasshopper because it's protected. And then do that, and then what I could do is make it a little wee bit darker. But what I'm going to do is immediately create 3 different layers, because what I would do then is take this and actually feather it out where this orange starts, and that way it'll look like it's disappearing into the orange. But what that is doing is actually immediately creating 3 different layers. Now I'll have a foreground orange and red. I'll have the middle layer of this blue dead, for example, tree I just made, and then the blues and purples with the orange up in here as a background. So I immediately created foreground, middle ground, background just by taking advantage of this line that's already here. But now keep in mind, remember how much this background changed as I was leaving the colors blend there is some really great watercolor mixing going on here. So that is something that can't be overlooked either, that when you have a spontaneous mix such as that, I think that one last important note that should be said is when I start doing these watercolor mixes, I never count on getting the same thing that I already got. So I always save either every layer or every Rebelle file as it is. Because if I really like something, I can definitely not count on getting the same thing again. It is too spontaneous the way the colors mix. Now, with that all said about this one, let's move on to our final portrait of the elephant that we drew out freehand and see how that goes from there. And then we can actually move into it and finish that one in a traditional way also. Let's go to the elephant. Okay, just a quick word about just freehand drawing. If you're trying to start freehand drawing and you just need a little bit of help for yourself, then just consider any type of a graph method. And that is, if we go up here and open up our image and import it, this one right here is the photo I'm going to draw. And being that I had a 6x4 image up here at 300 dpi, that was the exact same size as my photo. So that is what would be considered a 3:2 aspect ratio. And as long as we keep our painting in that same 3:2 aspect ratio, we would be fine. And now what I mean by that is the 3:2, the common number here would be 2. So 2 times 3 is 6, and 2 times 2 is 4. So that would be the 3 and the 2. Now, if I wanted to make this a larger 3:2 aspect ratio, then I could even consider the common number of actually something, for example, say 6, then that would make it an 18x12. The 3 would be 3 times 6 is 18, and the 2x6 would be then 12. Now, with that said, we will go ahead and lock that in place. And what I mean by graphing is when I draw something, I do nothing but draw imaginary lines, vertical and horizontal. If I draw this imaginary vertical line here, then I could see the inside of the eye lining up with the edge of the actual upper lip. And then if I draw a horizontal line here, I could see that the bottom of the ear is just about even with the edge of the tusk. Now, if I want to get more accurate and start dividing this photo up in sections, then as long as I stay with the same aspect ratio, I would be fine by doing that. And then I could take a 4x6, or in this case, a 6x4 image, and enlarge it and freehand draw it with a little bit of graph help up to an 18x12. Let's do a real quick graph just to divide this down a little bit more sections to show you what I mean. Okay, I just finished up a quick graph, and all I did was draw diagonals from corner to corner and then dropped a vertical in that center, and then just went ahead and repeated the same pattern. Dropped this blue line from here down to here, and then this one from here up to here, and found that center, and then the same thing here. And when you do this and create just any type of a graph to break down your image in smaller sections, it might be a lot easier to draw out, knowing that where you duplicate this graph pattern over your painting on a separate layer, then maybe it might help you freehand draw out something if you want to start freehanding, but you might need a little bit of help. Now, obviously, you could import the picture and just trace it, but that is tracing, obviously not freehand. So this might give you a little bit of help, and then keep in mind, if I actually even turn off the diagonals, it's a lot less busy and confusing. And then what I can even do is then save this image as a new reference image and then import it in my reference image folder And then that way, those lines will already be on there, and then just make a separate layer on my painting. And that way I could go ahead and draw each as they are. And then as long as you keep the same aspect ratio, then you should come out the same. In other words, if this is a 6x4, and I drew it up to an 18 by 12, that is also a 3:2 aspect ratio, then I should be okay by duplicating each one of these, or just giving me reference points where the eye is, where the tusk is, where the bottom of the ear is, where it starts to curve up, any of those things. It might help me draw it more accurately and not be so overwhelming. Let's do a dry run of a graph system ready to go. What I will do first is save my reference image with the graph on it, and then open up my new paper that I want to paint on, which will be the 18 by 12 at 300 dpi. Now I will start constructing the same graph on my 18 by 12 just as I did on my reference image. Quickly drawing in the diagonals so I could drop my verticals and horizontals where they cross, and then I could turn off the diagonals and I'm ready to go. Now, with that all said, let's go ahead and draw out our actual elephant portrait. Okay, I'm going to open up my 24 by 16 at 300 dpi, and that is the same aspect ratio, the actual 3:2, which is the 24 and 16, the common number 8. Now, when I'm drawing out my actual elephant, I just wanted to place a couple of lines at a starting point of some kind. If I start drawing too much detail in any one place, I'm not going to be too concerned about it, because I could use my selection tool, lift it out and move it, enlarge it, shrink it down, do whatever I want, and take advantage of digital drawing. Let's take a look and see if we have to make any changes. Okay, let's take a look and see what we got. Just a preliminary sketch, just starting to block things in. My ear does not look as big as it should. So for that reason, I think when I first put the eye in place, I made it a little bit too far to the left and then started working from there. And this shape down here of the trunk itself is a little bit too big in proportion compared to my picture reference, which is right here. And I'll put up the quick link onto how to get to these panels. But this right here, you could see this area right in here, from here over, is much smaller in proportion than this down here. So I think what happened was I made my ear much smaller accidentally by moving the whole face over to the left a little bit. So what I'm going to do is we'll move this out of our way for now, and then I'm going to close this. And this is just the thoughts of actually how I draw. And I would actually grab my tool right here. You know what, let's call this drawing layer first so we know what we're doing. And then I'm going to make another layer below it just to have it ready. And then we'll go back to the drawing layer, and what I'm going to do is grab my selection tool, and I'm going to start right in here and go down to just about the edge. And then I'm going to lock the top and bottom right at the edge of the paper. And then I will select that and make that the total area I'm going to move, because I think that whole entire area, once I grab my selection tool, my move tool, I'm just going to move and nudge that whole entire shape over to the right until that space of the trunk is a little wee bit more. And then you could see that's making our ear a lot bigger. And then I'm also going to change this angle right here and make it straight down just a little wee bit more, and that will help. But in the end, the idea here is to, once you start drawing, yes, you could just start somewhere to start drawing. Because keep in mind, we have to have an actual half-decent, accurate pencil drawing to go by, because in transparent watercolors, we cannot just block things out like opaque paints. If we were doing oils or something like that, which we've done in the past, then we could just go back over, cover things up, change things as we paint. But we have to have our shapes and our proportions down pretty well before we start painting watercolors, because we'll be able to see every layer that we do. Now, with that in mind, I'm going to nudge this over just a little wee bit more to the right, and I will leave it there. And then what we will do is deselect, just Control D, and then I'm going to change. I'll put in this line here, but we won't worry about that too much, because what I am going to do is actually bring this back in, and I want to actually put in all these little dents in its ear anyway, just more or less like for character and what have you. So I don't want a perfect straight line on this big of a painting, because it's 24 by 16, and that big of a painting, we have to start putting in a little wee bit more details, because that is a fairly sizable painting, just the actual size that I'm working on right now. And then we will also put some of these lines in, but this would be a good place to have paint dripping down, since there is a strong linear pattern there anyway, and that's where our drips will actually enhance the pattern of the elephant, and they won't compete or draw attention away from other things that are going on. And then plus I also want to make the body of the elephant itself fairly dark, because the ear is fairly light. And again, I always say you can't have dark without light and light without dark. And that would be the same back in here. There's a subtle orange glow, and because I took these photos myself, I know the orange glow is coming from all the hay that is on the ground, the straw and hay, whatever it may be. And on a direct sunny day, it was reflecting back in underneath the elephants. Now, I am photographing on the shadowed side. You can see a little wee bit of sun right up in here, and that's it. Otherwise, this is the complete shadowed side, which often has the best color on a sunny day. Okay, now we're going to move this guy out, and we're going to go ahead and finish this drawing here. And I'm going to go back in and make these changes here, and we'll draw that in. And I think our elephant ear will be a little bit better to proportion. Even if I have to change this right in here, I'll look again. It doesn't look too bad as far as the space from here to here. But then keep in mind, since we are going from the photograph exactly, we can actually even import the image itself and put it in underneath our drawing just to compare what it looks like and see how well we did compared to the photograph. But we did freehand draw it, and then sometimes that is important just to be able to change things from an original photo or to add things from other photos. But it is a good idea to have an accurate pencil drawing doing watercolors. Let's go ahead and finish up this drawing. Okay, working in just the nicks and cuts on the elephant ear. One thing I'd like to point out is just the better and more you work on your freehand drawing skills, that is a very important part of just art in general, that the power of observation is very important to the creative process. Okay, let's take a look and see what we have. Our portrait of our elephant is pretty well roughed in, and we have all of our shapes and proportions defined to the point where we're ready to start painting. Let's open up our reference and see what we got. Now, you could see there's a ton of colors involved in this. I would call this like the quinacridone golds and raw siennas, raw umbers up in here. That would be the same colors. And then you have even a little bit of a rose color down in here, which I think would work well if I just even lightly used a permanent rose, and just very lightly. And then over in here, we have some more golds and tans and browns. But then at the bottom of the ear, the whole way across, I'll probably start introducing a little bit of blues, and then maybe even just like a gray blue that I'll work with my blues and browns mixing together. Now, here's the thing we have to remember. In a painting such as this, the ear, especially up in here on top, we have to establish our layering fairly quick, but then also if we want multiple textures, then what we'd have to do is build them up very lightly. Otherwise, we'll get too dark too quick. And for that reason, what I'll do is I'll start laying down real light pastel colors of these areas. And then what I think I'll do is go back in and just erase out where the big veins are. I think that would be easier than painting around it for the most part. And then we could go back in and put the shadows in wherever we put the veins at. And then that would help just give it more of a three-dimensional look. The hair up in here, it would probably be easier to go to a mixed media type effect and then just paint whatever we need to paint and then go back over it with an opaque white or opaque white mixed in with some colors, whether it be just the actual, looks like rose color here, and then a little wee bit of blues in there somewhere too, right in here, and maybe even a tinge of purple. But you could see that I'll put a little bit of the dioxazine purple, which is right here, in some places here and there, that it would look well with the rest of the colors, and then have that orange glow underneath. So now that we have all our colors planned and we have it drawn out and in proportion ready to go, let's start painting our portrait of our elephant. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is just put down a couple of general washes. That will be over the entire painting. And then now what I'm doing is I'm selecting off the ear. But what I will do is coat it with a layer of just clear water so I can actually then use the transparency lock on these different sections. What I did was just divide it down into 3 sections, the ear, the body, and the head, and then duplicated those layers over so I have multiple layers of the exact same thing. But what this allowed me to do was that as long as I keep the transparency lock on those different layers, I'll never have to use a selection tool to select out that area because it already has a transparency lock on that given area. Now what I'm doing is just going over, and again, I'm letting the water do the work, that if I need a leather look texture, then I will use my spray brush or my sand brush and then allow it to bleed out and carry the pigment so it makes little white dimples here and there, and that is the exact texture that I'm looking for. I will also leave some areas just a little bit lighter than what they will be because I'm also going to run some paints, let them bleed together, and make the bottom of it just a little bit more abstract-y. Going over the trunk area now, I'm just starting to rough in certain areas just to give myself an idea of where things are going to be. My first goal will be to eliminate the pencil drawing, and then that'll give me a better understanding where everything is going to be for good. Blocking in around the eye and just the lines, I'll have to diffuse those a little bit later. I don't want no real hard lines, but I would actually rather diffuse them the way I want, because there's a diffusion side and there might be a little wee bit of a hard edge side. And for watercolors, it would be tough to do one straight edge and one soft diffused edge with the same line. Going back in again, refining some of the, just where the ribs are and the front of the shoulder. I will leave some of those just half finished and let that bleed out into the bottom of the paper. Now what I just did was I took my blues and purples of that more or less almost like a steel color on the ears. But then what I did was, since I put it on its own layer, I actually then selected all the transparent area of that same layer and then select a new layer and then put my orange down. We will take a look at that and you'll see how the fuzzy orange and gold of the quinacridone gold butts right up against that bluish purple. And to be able to do that, I just use my selection tool to select the exact opposite area of that blue and purple. Refining, just slowly taking everything deeper and deeper. I will work on the same layer in different areas. As long as those areas are not touching, then I could always go back in and do what I want with that specific area. Our elephant portrait is starting to take shape. Let's do a painting update and see what we have. Okay, let's just do a quick update and just review a couple things here quickly. Just to go back to that blue and orange, that was a little bit important. This right here, these patterns in here, you can see how the bluish steel color, bluish purple, butts right up against the oranges and tans, but in a pretty much complicated pattern. So to duplicate that, what I did was I put down my blues and purples any way I wanted to on a separate new layer. And then what I did was I selected the entire alpha area, which means just the transparent area. And then that way I moved to a different separate layer, new layer, and then started put my orange down. And then that way the only area I could be painting is everything but the blue purple area. And this gave me really odd, intricate shapes of one color butting right up against another color. Now, if we look at some of the other areas, I still got a ways to go in the dark. Now, this entire lower body, I might just splash all that down and just leave a little hint of some of the skin. But I think what I'll do is make the focal point just the textures of the ear, and then also the eye and this area in here. And then that way, that will become more of a focal point where all the detail will be. And that is this area right in here. I'll start putting more reds and purples, just to even strengthen it up. And again, to keep my permanent rows, if I use permanent rows up in these areas up in here, then at the very end, what I may do is just put that on a single separate wash, not to contaminate that permanent rose. Then that way it'll be a nice clean permanent rose that will not be mixed down with any other colors. And that's what I would want. A transparent optical mix is one thing, but mixing two colors together is something completely different. Now, just looking at some of the things I have to do yet, I have to go quite a bit darker in some areas. And then I will diffuse some of these lines out. Let's take a look at those lines one last time. And you could see that what's happening here is there may be a diffusion on one side of that line, but then on the other side might be fairly straight. It's depending on where the light is coming from and what angle it's hitting these little bumps of skin, and that will give them just say, for example, this right here, this is a fairly straight edge right through here, but then the other side of that gray line is actually the shading of this chunk of skin right here. So that's what I'll end up doing, whether it be putting a soft line on top of that line to keep one edge straight and then leave the other side bleed in, or just take my blender and diffuse one side down. I may do that here and there. It may not have to be everywhere, but it should be enough that I want to actually achieve that end goal there of what's going on. And that will just make our skin look more like skin and not just a graphic outline of where the individual shapes are. It will bring a more three-dimensional look to it, actually. With that all said, let's go ahead and just finish this painting and see what we're left with. Okay, here's where I'm starting to destroy all those lines and edges, just to make them look more like shapes and not just a straight line with a straight edge on each side of the line. One of the sides have to be toned down just to make an appearance of a rounded shape. Working in on the eyes and the detail, I'm just slowly progressing everything about the picture, and every now and then I'll look back and see what I have just to see where I need to focus on next. Here again, I'm just softening up some of the edges on those straight, hard lines, which makes a big difference. There I'm adding a little wee bit of blues and purples to the lip area, just going by my reference, whatever it suggests, and then also just doing some things on my own, just a little bit, just to actually put a little wee bit of an artsy touch to this elephant. Defining up some of the details, I first started making the hair of the ear, and I made it a little bit too coarse the first time, so I erase it all out later and try it again a little wee bit more narrower to put it in proportion with the elephant. There I'm just going back over and shadowing the areas of the big veins on the ears, putting in the eyelashes. Here's where I'm putting in the new hair on the ear, darkening up some of the areas. Now I'm just going over some of the textured skin to actually make it look like it has a glow from beneath it. A little wee bit of script work, putting in some of the final touches. I will leave specific areas a little wee bit undone just to bring more attention to the finished areas. Let's take a look and see what we have. Okay, let's take a look and see what we have with our final painting here. Just remember, a quick review of the entire demo. We started out with a Grasshopper, and we did it and traced it just for those who may need help drawing, and then just went ahead and finished that one in a pretty much the same way we did this one. 3/4 of it was detailed, and then a little wee bit on the abstracty, artsy side, with some of it just to give you a demo on how to do runs and how it's still even important layering even the runs. Now, there are so many benefits to actual layering. I tried to cover as many as I can in this particular demo. The one with the robot, that was more or less just to give you ideas of where I come up with my concepts, because a lot of the paintings I do, I think because I come out of a photography background also, then a lot of my photos are just ready to paint as is, because I'm out in the field looking for photo reference for paintings also, and then I have something in mind. With this elephant, the same thing. When I photographed it at the zoo, I was looking for something that would be interesting and something I could duplicate in textures with the watercolors. Again, only using the colors that I use in regular traditional transparent watercolors. The benefits of digital are phenomenal, and when you combine the traditional watercolor painting that Rebelle 5 has to offer, combining that with digital, it is an exceptional experience. The reason why is because you have the benefits of both combined together. And with that said, looking back in my traditional days, actually, the more time you spent on the painting, the more critical your work got, because you knew if you actually made a sizable mistake, then you would have to start all over, including a drawing, including a pencil sketch, everything. And that is why sometimes if I would do more of an elaborate painting, I would do the drawing out on tracing paper, so at least I literally didn't have to draw it all over again. That way I would just put the tracing paper down on a new piece of paper, put graphite paper underneath that, retrace it out, and then start painting all over again. Anybody that could do every painting perfectly without any mistakes, I would be very impressed with them, because you have to learn somewhere, that's for sure. Now, with all that said, let's take a look at our elephant here. And if you notice, one thing I want to show you is actually that just the photograph itself is a good bit darker than our actual painting. So you can look down in here and just the colors, that has a nice snap color to it, and it is reasonably darker than our painting. So what we could do about that is take advantage of layers again, and even all the different blending modes, different things you could do with layers, isolating specific areas. As I've said in the past in this actual demo, I will work on different sections on the same layer, but as long as this eye is on one layer and then a part of this over here is on the same layer, as long as they're not touching each other, then I can work on either areas without worrying about affecting anything else on that area of the layer. Now, what I can do now with this one is, if I do want to make it darker, what we'll do is go up here and grab everything and go all the way down to the very base wash. And what I do, I like to call it sandwiching all the layers together. We will merge them all. And now that it is just actually literally one layer, if I turn it off, that's our entire painting. But what we can do now is duplicate that layer right here. And that would be just make another one of the exact same thing. But now here's the problem. It comes out pretty orangey. and the quinacridone gold is being a little wee bit overdone. So what I would consider is going up here, making this, I'd say about 50, cutting it back, not dark as twice as much. But then what I also would want to do is it's still a little bit orangey. So if I use multiply, it's going to deepen anything 50% and beyond, which would be a good idea. And that would be right here. Now that has a nice snap to it. These colors look well. I'll bring the photograph back in, and if I wanted to duplicate the photo, then I can actually be a little wee bit more pleased with this. And again, the certain areas are just left unfinished. I put a little wee bit of hair under its chinny chin just to actually give it a focal point down here with the tusk, and then the eye itself and the ear itself I would consider the larger focal points. But one thing I did do is kill the white that was going around it, and I didn't like that because the only reason why is that white, for me compositionally, was competing with the ear. If I have a light colored object and then it goes dark, then it goes light, then that might be, if you could easily explain it compositionally, if you could imagine an all white paper with a black circle on it anywhere, at just say a fourth of the size of the paper, but then I put another black ring around it, then that would be a lot more complicated than actually just having an all white paper with a black circle, or for that matter, an all black paper with a white circle. You're actually zeroing in on your light and dark shapes much quicker than actually staggering them. If I have light here with the ear, then dark, then light, what happens is this area right here, if this was white, it would be competing with the ear, and it would be drawing my attention down here. So as soon as I made all of this bottom page dark, then I only have this white, and that's it. And then the eye with the detail, and it's kind of a darker shape up against a lighter background over here. What I'm trying to do is pull attention to the eye area and the ear area, and that's it. Now, with all these different things said, I would call this the War and Peace version of the layers of this particular demo. And this would pretty much conclude this demo. Hopefully you got something out of it. And I tried to give you as many examples as I could with just how to use layers and how much of a benefit there is using the digital watercolors in a traditional way, but still taking advantage of all of the options and choices digital has to offer. So with that said, this will conclude this demo. Until we see you out in the field or back at the studio, thanks for watching.